The story of Jesus Christ spans boundaries, languages, and centuries. His teachings have molded entire civilizations, inspired billions, and continue to bring solace and hope to many individuals. However, one important aspect of Jesus' identity has often been forgotten or erased: his African heritage. For millennia, Western cultures depicted Jesus as a fair-skinned, blue-eyed person in religious art and images. However, this picture is very different from the historical and geographical reality of who Jesus was. The idea that Jesus may have had African ancestry is not new. However, it has been buried for centuries under cultural and theological oppression. To dispute the popular image of Jesus as a white man is to confront long-held assumptions. However, ignoring the notion of a black Jesus erases an important part of his story, one that has the potential to transform our understanding of race, identity, and faith in the modern world. In an era when discussions about racial justice, identity, and inclusion are more vital than ever, finding Jesus' African identity is extremely significant. What does it mean to have forgotten this aspect of Jesus' identity? And why is it so important to restore it today? To find the answers, we must look into early historical records, face the willful deletion of this narrative, and acknowledge the urgent need to restore this reality. If these questions inspire you and you want to learn more, subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content. We would love to hear your ideas and comments below. To unravel the buried story of Black Jesus, we must first investigate the historical and scriptural data that testify to his African origins. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Roman-occupied Judea, as a Middle Eastern Jew from a territory that connected 3 continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe. Judea's placement at the crossroads of these lands created a melting pot of cultures and peoples. In ancient times, racial categories were not as tightly defined as they are today. Rather, ethnic variety was more broadly accepted. This background of cultural interchange allows us to delve deeper into Jesus' links with Africa. One of Jesus' most obvious connections to Africa occurs in the Gospel of Matthew, when his family fled to Egypt to avoid King Herod's lethal sentence. After being warned in a dream, Joseph carried Mary and the baby Jesus to Egypt for safety. Egypt, a North African country, had long been a shelter for Jews, particularly during times of persecution, like the Babylonian exile. This flight to Egypt represents a watershed episode in Jesus' early life. It also represents his family's ties to the African continent. The choice of Egypt as a sanctuary for Jesus was no accident. Africa has a history of providing refuge in times of need. By fleeing there, Jesus' family joined a heritage of African places that provided refuge. The fact that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus integrated into Egyptian society implies that they had physical characteristics akin to the native dark-skinned populace. If they had appeared drastically different, they might have attracted undesired attention, implying that Jesus and his family had more African features than are often shown in Western art. Early Christian art and iconography from Africa lend credence to this African connection. In Egypt and Ethiopia, ancient images of Jesus show him with dark skin, shaggy hair, and distinctively African facial features. The Coptic Christians of Egypt, one of the world's oldest Christian communities, have continuously depicted Jesus in ways that reflect their ethnic identity. These depictions were not limited to Egypt alone. In Ethiopia, where Christianity stretches back to the 4th century, Jesus has long been portrayed as having African roots. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a highly historical Christian tradition, believes Jesus was of African descent. This idea has impacted Ethiopian Christians' religion and identity for generations, creating a compelling image of Jesus who represents them. Another important African figure in Jesus' life was Simon of Cyrene, who, according to the Gospels, assisted Jesus in carrying his cross to the crucifixion. Simon hails from Cyrene, a city in modern-day Libya, North Africa. He was probably a dark-skinned African man visiting Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. His act in supporting Jesus during his final moments exemplifies the close relationship between African and Jewish populations. Simon's presence at such a critical period serves as a reminder of Africa's impact on Jesus' tale. While these narratives do not provide conclusive evidence of Jesus' African heritage, they do call into question the long-standing picture of a white Jesus, which has dominated Western society. From Renaissance art to contemporary media, representations of Jesus have frequently coincided with European ideals, eliminating the ethnic diversity around his life. These depictions represent a narrative that aided European colonial ambitions by fostering conceptions of Christian superiority and white dominance, concepts that are far removed from the historical reality of Jesus' life. Despite decades of oppression, the idea of a Black Jesus has persisted. The concept of Jesus' African roots has endured across Africa and among individuals of African heritage. For many people, Jesus represents not only heavenly love and sacrifice, but also their ethnic and cultural identity. The historical and spiritual connections between Africa and Jesus' life are commemorated throughout African Christian traditions, art, and theology, reminding us that the story of Jesus is inextricably linked to Africa's rich legacy. The eradication of Jesus' African identity was not an accident. It was deliberate, motivated by cultural, political, and theological considerations. As Christianity grew over Europe in the early centuries, it became associated with imperial power, and later, colonial expansion. European rulers, particularly in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, propagated a version of Jesus that reflected their own race. This picture assisted them in consolidating power and reinforcing their authority by depicting a white, European-looking Jesus as superior and in control. One major turning point in this shift happened during Emperor Constantine's reign in the 4th century. Following his conversion to Christianity, Constantine made it the official religion of the Roman Empire, combining political unity and spiritual strength. The Council of Nicaea, held in 325 AD, was essential in developing Christian ideas, and it marked the beginning of the turn toward European ideals in the image of Jesus. Artists influenced by Greco-Roman beauty standards began to depict Jesus with light skin, straight hair, and European features. This was more than just an artistic choice. It was a planned decision that aligned with the Roman Empire's cultural and political objectives. A white Jesus became the face of European Christianity, gradually obscuring his genuine Middle Eastern and African origins. As European colonization spread, this picture of a white Jesus traveled across the Atlantic. In the Americas, European invaders utilized this picture to legitimize their invasion and subjugation of indigenous and African peoples. A white Jesus represented divine authority, and this belief was used to justify systemic oppression. Missionaries projected this whitewashed image upon African and indigenous populations, maintaining racial hierarchies and spreading the notion that whiteness was synonymous with spiritual supremacy. This purposeful whitewashing was reinforced by theologians who ignored or downplayed Jesus' African roots. By the time of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, the idea of a white Jesus had become so ingrained in Christian thought that any mention of a Black or African Jesus was disregarded, even deemed heretical. Although the Reformation altered Christian practices, it did little to challenge the racialized image of Jesus. This distortion had far-reaching effects. It influenced how race and identity were perceived within Christian theology. The portrayal of Jesus as white perpetuated the idea that whiteness was synonymous with divinity and moral purity, while non-white people were ostracized. This belief system served to rationalize slavery, colonialism, and subsequently, racial segregation. The white Jesus became a symbol of power and superiority, perpetuating oppressive structures that have devastated African and indigenous populations for generations. Religious and governmental leaders collaborated to perpetuate these racial hierarchies, employing the image of a white Jesus to maintain social control. Meanwhile, African links to Jesus, such as his family's departure to Egypt or the involvement of Simon of Cyrene, were minimized or rewritten to fit a Eurocentric narrative. The idea that Jesus could have resembled people from the Middle East or North Africa faded throughout time, replaced by European portrayals that not only perpetuated racial distinctions, but also transformed spiritual understandings of Christianity. The ramifications of this historical erasure are severe. By preaching a white Jesus, the Church contributed to a worldview in which non-white people were regarded as inferior. This belief system supported racist ideologies that justified exploitation, slavery, and colonization. The image of a white Jesus served as a foundation for oppressive regimes that dehumanized African, indigenous, and other non-European people. Today, scholars and theologians are addressing this historical distortion by re-examining biblical texts, historical documents, and early Christian art. They are working to recover Jesus' African identity, not just to correct historical mistakes, but to address the racial injustices that have continued in his name. Restoring Jesus' African roots helps dismantle the harmful assumption that divinity is linked to whiteness, promoting a more inclusive and just vision of Christian faith. For African and African-descended Christians, reclaiming the image of Black Jesus is a powerful form of empowerment. They have often felt alienated from a version of Jesus that reflects their racial and cultural identity. By reclaiming aspects of Jesus' life that are African, they reconnect with a faith that acknowledges their heritage. This reclamation is an act of historical justice, demonstrating that Jesus' message of love, equality, and justice transcends race and culture. In today's society, the neglected tale of Black Jesus is extremely important, especially in the struggle for racial justice, identity, and equality. The legacies of racism, colonialism, and white supremacy continue to impact societies around the world. The picture of a Black Jesus challenges deeply held beliefs about power and privilege. Reclaiming this picture allows us to reimagine religion as a force for healing, solidarity, and justice. For many African Americans, the notion of a white Jesus represents estrangement and pain. During slavery, millions of Africans were forced to convert to Christianity, not out of concern for their spiritual well-being, but to maintain control. White Jesus was portrayed as the personification of oppression, promoting the idea that whiteness was associated with piety, authority, and supremacy. Enslaved Africans were expected to worship a divinity that resembled their enslavers, resulting in a painful contradiction. The liberating messages of the Gospels were overshadowed by an image that symbolized white supremacy. Even after slavery ended, the image of a white Jesus persisted in Black churches, influencing how many African Americans related to their faith. This portrayal created a disconnect between Jesus' teachings on justice for the disadvantaged and the real experiences of African Americans. Many people were left wondering how to reconcile their faith in a Jesus who preached freedom with an image used to justify persecution. This dissonance prompted a movement to reclaim Jesus in a way that resonated with their own experiences and identities. In recent years, the movement to recover Black Jesus has gained traction. Theologians, pastors, and activists, particularly those affiliated with organizations like Black Lives Matter, emphasize the significance of Black Jesus in affirming Black dignity and humanity. Black Jesus is a symbol of resistance to oppression, representing the struggles of the impoverished, underprivileged, and oppressed. The Gospels tell the story of Jesus, a man born into poverty, living under Roman domination, and ultimately executed for fighting injustice. This narrative speaks deeply to African Americans and people of color who have experienced racial discrimination, police violence, and economic exploitation firsthand. The image of Black Jesus also critiques systemic racism and white supremacy in both religious and secular institutions. By reclaiming Jesus as an African man, theologians and activists challenge the link between Christianity and whiteness. Black Jesus becomes a radical symbol of justice and equality, reminding us that God's love and liberation are meant for all people, regardless of race or ethnicity. In contrast to the whitewashed images of Jesus, Black Jesus encourages us to rethink Christianity as a faith that supports the downtrodden and opposes all forms of racial and social injustice. This reclamation impacts the broader discourse about race and identity within the church. Multiracial and African American congregations are reconsidering rewiring conventional depictions of Jesus, recognizing that they are not neutral and reflect centuries of racial bias. Embracing Black Jesus validates their identities while challenging narratives that have historically excluded them. Outside of religious contexts, Black Jesus has become a powerful symbol in the struggle for racial justice. Movements such as Black Lives Matter use Black Jesus as a symbol of resistance to state-sanctioned violence and oppression. Black Jesus appears in rallies, speeches, and art, reminding people that the fight for racial equality is both spiritual and political. The parallels between Jesus' life and the lives of people of color who experience oppression are clear. Many people today, like Jesus, encounter societal structures that are violent, dehumanizing, and oppressive. The story of Black Jesus pushes Christians to consider how religion has been used to justify oppression. It invites believers to reconsider their perspectives on race, power, and privilege, and to construct a vision of justice that aligns with Jesus' teachings, restoring the forgotten story of Black Jesus, a path to truth and justice. For far too long, the story of Black Jesus has been ignored, erased, and purposely silenced. However, as we confront the painful legacies of racism, colonialism, and white supremacy, this forgotten narrative demands to be brought back into the light. The image of Black Jesus, long obscured by whitewashed portrayals, serves as a powerful reminder of the diversity and inclusiveness at the heart of the Christian message. Reclaiming the story of Black Jesus means confronting a narrative purposefully marginalized by Eurocentric dominance in art, religion, and culture. Recognizing Jesus' African roots, his identity as a Middle Eastern Jew in a multicultural, ethnically diverse ancient world, is a bold act of truth-telling. It challenges systems that perpetuate racial inequality, affirming the dignity and humanity of Black people, both historically and today. In honoring Black Jesus, we remember the fullness of a faith capable of healing, transforming, and uniting people across racial and ethnic boundaries. This act of remembrance is about more than just correcting history. It is about embracing the true essence of Christianity. It is a vision of a world that is just, inclusive, and loving, where all people are treated equally in the eyes of God. Black Jesus is more than a historical figure. He represents the ongoing struggle for justice, a beacon of hope for the oppressed, and a reminder that eradicating racism is a sacred calling. As we work to reconstruct his story, we are invited to imagine a more just and equitable future for everyone.